Close your eyes and imagine the sound of 10,000 hammers hitting an anvil, all at once, non-stop, for 14 hours. That isn't a war zone. That isn't a nightmare. That is Tuesday in 1845. In Manchester, in Lowell, Massachusetts, and in the tobacco ports of Manila, the world was being rebuilt from the ground up, and the raw material they used wasn't iron, it wasn't cotton, it was people. We call it the Industrial Revolution. We put it in textbooks next to steam engines and top hats and a man named Watt. We teach it like it was a triumph. But the men, women, and children who lived it had a different name for it. They called it the Devil's Mill. If you were physically transported into a Victorian textile mill today, with your modern body, your modern lungs, and your modern expectations, you would not survive a full shift. The question isn't whether the factory would kill you. The question is, which part of it would get you first? This is the history they skipped in school. Let's go to work. Your alarm is not an alarm. It is your overseer banging on a thin wooden door at 4:15 in the morning. You don't shower. There is no shower. You splash your face with water from a shared bucket that 6 other families used before you. You eat, if you're lucky, a piece of bread the size of your fist. Stale, maybe moldy at the edge. You eat it anyway. Then you walk, in the dark, in the cold, in shoes that may or may not have soles left on them. You arrive at the mill by 4:30 a.m. The machines are already running. They never stopped. They ran through the night. They will run through your shift. They will run after you go home. The machines do not rest. Only the workers do, and only barely. The first thing that hits you is the noise. Not loud, overwhelming. The crash and clatter of spinning mules and power looms operating at full speed is measured at over 100 decibels. That is louder than a chainsaw. That is louder than standing next to a jackhammer. And you will stand in it, not for a minute, not for an hour, but for 14 hours straight. By the time you're 40, if you make it to 40, you will be functionally deaf. Workers developed their own lip-reading system just to communicate across the floor, an entire language born from the fact that speech was physically impossible. But the noise is not what kills you first. The air is. Victorian mills, especially cotton mills, did not have ventilation. Ventilation was expensive. Ventilation was also considered dangerous, not to the workers, but to the thread. Cotton fiber breaks in dry air, so the owners kept the mills sealed, suffocating. The air inside a working cotton mill was not air. It was a suspension of microscopic fiber particles so dense you could see it move. They called it cotton lung. The medical term is byssinosis. It is a progressive destruction of your pulmonary tissue, your lungs slowly replaced with scar fiber, becoming less and less capable of expanding. Workers described it as breathing through a wet wool blanket that got thicker every year. By age 25, long-term mill workers showed lung capacity equivalent to a 60-year-old with emphysema. By 30, many could not climb a flight of stairs without stopping. And nobody told them. The owners knew. There is documented evidence, internal correspondence between mill owners in Lancashire, acknowledging the lung damage and concluding it was an acceptable cost of production. Those letters are in the British National Archives. You can read them today. Now, let's talk about the children. In 1833, just to give you a benchmark, the British Factory Act was passed. It was considered a reform, a victory for child welfare. Do you know what it said? It said children under 9 could no longer work in textile mills. Under 9, which means before 1833, there was no lower limit. The children who worked the mills had job titles, specific titles, for specific horrors. The scavenger was typically 6 to 10 years old. Their job was to crawl under the spinning mules, massive moving machines on rails, while the machines were in motion, to collect loose cotton that had fallen to the floor. The cotton was valuable. The child was not. If the machine's timing was off, if a gear slipped, if the rails moved a second early, the child did not come back out. The piecer was slightly older, 8 to 12 typically. Their job was to reach into the moving machinery to rejoin broken threads with their fingers at speed. The result was a specific pattern of injury so common it had a name: piecer's hand. Fingers ground down to stubs, knuckles deformed, all before puberty. The hurrier worked in coal mines adjacent to the mill economy, children harnessed like animals to coal carts, crawling through tunnels too small for adults, dragging loads of 200 pounds or more. Parliamentary testimony from 1842 includes a report of a 6-year-old girl named Patience Kershaw, who described her daily route as 11 trips through a half-mile tunnel every day, 6 days a week. Her testimony helped pass the Mines Act of 1842. She was considered a hero. She was also 6 years old and already permanently hunched from the harness. Now, let's cross the Atlantic, because America had its own version of this story, and it came packaged with a marketing campaign. Lowell, Massachusetts, 1820s. The mill owners had a problem. American workers, particularly men, were not accepting the factory conditions that British workers had been broken into accepting over decades. So the owners had an idea: market the mills to young women from rural New England, frame it as opportunity, independence, education. The Lowell girls, as they were branded, were promised dormitory housing, access to lending libraries, and a chance to earn their own money before marriage. It was, for the 1820s, a genuinely compelling pitch. Here's what the pitch left out. The dormitories held up to 6 women per room. The windows in the mills were nailed shut, not to trap the workers, but to maintain the humidity required for cotton thread. The temperature on the floor in summer exceeded 90 degrees Fahrenheit regularly. The work week was 70 to 80 hours. The lending library was open on Sunday, the one day off, when most workers were too exhausted to read. By the 1840s, as ownership consolidated and competition increased, conditions deteriorated faster than the workers could organize against them. Speed-ups, the practice of running machines faster to increase output without increasing pay, became standard. A worker doing the same job in 1845 was managing twice the machines she managed in 1825 for the same wage. When they tried to organize, when they tried to strike, the blacklist appeared. The blacklist was not a metaphor. It was a literal document circulated between mill owners across New England and eventually across the Atlantic, containing the names of workers who'd complained, organized, or left without permission. If your name was on it, you could not get work. Not in Lowell, not in Boston, not in Manchester. The empire of cotton was smaller than it looked, and its owners talked to each other. Here's what the part most Western history books skip entirely. The Industrial Revolution was not a British event. It was not an American event. It was a global system, and like all global systems, it required somewhere for the costs to go. The costs went south. They went east. They went to the places that don't get chapters in the textbook. The Philippines, under Spanish colonial rule and then American occupation, became a critical node in the global supply chain that fed the mills. Hemp, specifically abaca or Manila hemp, was the strongest natural fiber in the world. It was essential for the ropes that ran the ships that moved the cotton that fed the mills. Without Philippine hemp, the entire maritime supply chain of the British Empire slows down. The system used to extract that hemp was called polo y servicio. It was a forced labor obligation. Every male subject of the Spanish crown in the Philippines between the ages of 16 and 60 owed 40 days of labor per year to the state. No pay. You worked on roads, ports, shipyards, or fields based on where you were assigned. If you could not go yourself, you paid a falla, a fee. If you had neither time nor money, you went anyway. The heat of the tropical sun replaced the steam of the engine. The overseer with a ledger replaced the mill manager with a pocket watch. But the structure was identical. Your body, your time, and your future belonged to a system you did not choose, and you could not leave. In the tobacco-growing regions of Cagayan Valley, the Spanish established a state tobacco monopoly in 1782 that lasted a century. Farmers were legally required to grow tobacco, not food, and sell it exclusively to the colonial government at prices the government set. Families that could not meet their quota lost their land. Families that grew other crops faced fines or imprisonment. From the soot of Birmingham to the tobacco rows of Cagayan, the world was one giant assembly line. The workers in Manchester and the farmers in the Philippines had never met. They never would, but they were part of the same machine, and neither of them could get off. Here's the part that should make you furious, and then maybe a little bit hopeful. The people inside these systems were not passive. They were not broken. They fought back, constantly, creatively, and at tremendous personal risk. In Britain, the Luddite movement of the 1810s is remembered as anti-technology. That is a deliberate misreading of history. The Luddites were skilled textile workers, craftsmen who had spent years mastering their trade, who watched machines designed to replace them with cheaper, unregulated child labor arrive in their factories. They didn't smash machines because they feared progress. They smashed machines because the machines were being used to destroy their livelihoods and undercut safety standards. The distinction matters. In 1819, 60,000 people gathered at St. Peter's Field in Manchester to demand parliamentary reform and labor rights. The local magistrates panicked. They ordered cavalry to charge the crowd. 15 people were killed. Hundreds were wounded. The event was named Peterloo, a bitter reference to the Battle of Waterloo 4 years earlier. British soldiers had defeated Napoleon. 4 years later, they rode down their own people. In Lowell, women organized. They circulated petitions. They went on turnouts, early strikes in the 1830s, decades before formal union recognition. They were mocked in newspapers as hysterical. They were evicted from company dormitories. Some were arrested. Most went back to work because they had no other choice. And yet, slowly, grinding forward like the machines themselves, the 10-hour movement won. Child labor laws passed. Ventilation requirements came. Factory inspectors arrived. Not because the owners suddenly developed consciences, because enough people, over enough decades, refused to accept that this was simply how things were. Change did not come from the top. It never does. We look back at the 1840s and call it history. We call it the past. We reassure ourselves that we are different now. And in many ways, real, measurable ways, we are. The 8-hour day exists. Child labor laws exist. Occupational safety regulations exist. These are genuine achievements, bought at genuine cost by people whose names we mostly don't know. But here is the question worth sitting with. The garment factories producing the clothes you are wearing right now as you watch this, many of them operate in countries where those protections are weak, selectively enforced, or actively resisted by the same economic logic that nailed the windows shut in Lowell. The lung disease is different. The fiber is different. The geography is different. The structure is not. The machines are still turning. They just look different. A Victorian mill worker, Patience Kershaw, or one of the unnamed Lowell girls, or a hemp farmer in Cagayan who never made it into any record, if they could see the global supply chain operating right now, today, they would recognize it. Not the technology, not the scale, but the logic. Extract maximum output, minimize cost, externalize consequences, move on. The Industrial Revolution didn't end, it expanded. So here's your question for the comments, and I want a real answer, not a joke answer. If you were dropped into 1845 with nothing but the clothes on your back, which role do you think you'd actually end up in? Mill worker, scavenger, Lowell girl, colonial laborer? And what's the one thing you think you'd do differently than the people who were actually there? Because the people who were actually there weren't stupid. They were trapped. And understanding the difference between those two things might be the most important lesson this whole era has to teach us, because the gears don't stop for anyone.